Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Wednesday night service this evening. So I just invite you to take a deep breath. If you'd like to close your eyes, please do so. There is a power and a force, an intelligence moving through this universe, and it's alive, fully awake, fully present. All of it, all of the time, all at once. There is something truly magnificent out there that is forever expressing itself as the beauty, the joy, the love, the peace, the harmony, the very heart of this universe. It is known by many a name, by no name. It is spirit. It is source. It is God. Whatever name you'd like to call it, it answers. It is an energy unlike any other energy. It's creative energy in which every conceivable idea resides, making all things possible, and its evidence abounds everywhere. It is the very breath that breathes as us. It is the air we breathe. It is the voice we use to speak its power. It is the love. It is the light. It is that unconditional sacredness that is in with each one of us. It is that heart that beats in rhythm with the heart of all people, knowing that all of us are of one life, one heart, one love. That one life that is being and becoming everything and everyone, and never tiring in the process, for there is no place where God is not. In each one of us, this life expresses perfectly as we are, for we are individualized expressions of God in form. And we simply allow ourselves for Spirit to make itself known, to reveal itself to the world as each one of us, in our human form, in our human journey, as we are having our human experience. We appear different. We appear separate. But at the core, we are that one life, with a breath of that one life, where there is no separation. That is the truth of who we truly are. I am grateful for this journey. I am grateful for the experiences that it brings to each one of us. I am grateful for the life of Spirit. And I know that this evening is blessed, that each of you are blessed, and that we hold everyone in our hearts and in our minds who are expressing turmoil and trouble in this time, knowing the truth of who each one is. Taking a deep breath and celebrating your life as the life of Spirit, please join me in saying, and so it is.
So it is. Thank you, Doug. Good evening, everyone. Just want to make sure I'm unmuted here. Yes, I think I am. So we're talking about mindful action for equality and pride tonight. And it's, as you probably know, it's Pride Month. Usually we'd be celebrating in person this weekend, but everything's virtual this year. But I thought I would bring my pride flag, which Richard Robinson had me buy a few years ago so we could decorate the sanctuary with them. So yeah, I just wanted to thank Doug for the lovely meditation and the prayer, and thank Paul for his hosting tonight. And so our topic is about mindful action, and it seemed appropriate to talk about all of the action and the activity that is going on in the world right now, because we're living in quite a time in history where change is everywhere. Change is really in the air. Not only are we living through a pandemic, which is just a completely unprecedented time where we have to change our actions and change the way we think about things, but it's also kind of no coincidence that there's all this social and political change happening at the same time. So when I heard the topic was mindful action, I thought that is perfect, because I love to talk about action. I love to talk about activism and how we as science of mind practitioners can change the world by how we think, what we do, and by our mindful action. So I was thinking about just this month, all that has been happening, both kind of the best and worst of humanity, really. You know, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, it was started by obviously several murders of Black men, including George Floyd, that were collectively witnessed by the world. And in addition to that, we're dealing with Black men that are found hanging from nooses. Our Senate cannot pass a bill, an anti-lynching bill, after so many years of history. And at the same time, millions of people around the world are protesting in support of Black lives. Police reform bills are being passed, Confederate statues are coming down, slavery reparations bills are being put up in initiated in several states. And our consciousness is shifting. I think especially the consciousness of white people is shifting right now as we all join into this movement to end racism. And then during Pride Month, there's a lot going on as well. Probably a lot of people haven't heard this, but just in the past month, 5 transgender people were murdered in hate crimes. And mostly Black trans women. And on the very anniversary of the Pulse nightclub murders of 50 LGBTQ people, on that same day, our president, Trump, removed healthcare protections for transgender people. So there's sort of the worst and the best of times. And on the positive side, the Supreme Court passed this major civil rights, adding LGBTQ people to the civil rights legislation. And tens of thousands of people took to the street to march for Black and white transgender people. So it's just a time of intense change, and I just kind of wanted to start off with that context. Martin Luther King has a great quote that says, "Don't sleep through a great revolution." So I think we're all called to consider what's mine to do. And so what is mindful action? And how does it contribute to change? So one quote about mindful action is that mindful action involves bringing our whole self into the present moment, engaged with life as it unfolds. And the more we are mindful of our actions, the less pain and suffering we encounter. So how can we be fully present during this time of all times? There's so much to take in, there's so much to respond to, and so much to consider. Jon Kabat-Zinn the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction, says the aim of mindfulness is to act with clarity and intent. So what is clarity and intent? Well, Richard Schwartz talks about the higher self. If we're acting from the higher self, what qualities do we bring to a situation? And he talks about the 8 C's, the things that start with the letter C, which I love: calm, clarity, compassion, courage, caring, curiosity, confidence, and creativity. So usually I know I'm being mindful when I'm coming from some of those qualities. When we think about action, a good question to ask is, what's mine to do? Because that question in itself brings us into a mindfulness. Most of what we do in life tends to be based on habit, on programming, what we've learned from our parents, our culture, our education, our life experience, or our peers. Whereas mindfulness comes from this idea of meditation, that we are witnessing our thoughts and that we are aware of them. We're aware of what's running us. We're aware of our beliefs. And then we have more choice. We can choose, what do I believe? How do I want to act? So Ernest Holmes, in one of his sort of rare quotes where he talked about group sort of action for the whole, for the society, he says, "But faith without works is dead. We should not only pray, we should act, each contributing the best they have to the common purpose, each willing to make any sacrifice necessary. For there can be no individual self-preservation without the preservation of all." So we're in a time where we're considering, how do I want to be? How do I want this time to change me? So just going back to LGBTQ history a little bit, and Doug is going to give us a lot more about that. But for those of you not aware of how the movement started, well, it actually started far before that, but the sort of inciting incident was in 1969 during the Stonewall Rebellion. An interesting parallel with the time now, but it was an uprising mostly by people of color who were primarily transgender, drag queens, and that in a queer bar in New York City, and it was a rebellion against police harassment and brutality that had been going on for years, where the police harassed LGBTQ people who were gathering together, arrested them, shut down bars, etc. And this movement, there was so much rage that it went on for 6 days and nights, and people came from all over to join in. And that was kind of the spark that led to the movement and more awareness of this movement. So sometimes action erupts out of a moment that wakes people up and makes us mindful of the need for change. And that's happening right now with the Black Lives Movement. It happened with Stonewall. And so we're all awakening. Think about a time in your life when an awareness came to you of something you needed to do personally or for others that felt guided by spirit. What was the energy of it? Perhaps you felt that lately during all of the times that we're going through. I'm going to say a little bit more about what I've felt moved to do, but it's good to think about that for yourself. So Jamie Lula sings that beautiful song, Something's Calling Me, Something's Calling Me. So what is, that's a good question to ask. What is calling me? If spirit is behind everything, that then we're called to do whatever it is that is ours to do. So those LGBTQ people that, started the uprising at Stonewall, they were called to take a courageous and perhaps deadly risk to start this movement that they didn't even know they were starting. Um, so as we observe other people that are taking action, it shifts us. And I think what many people are awakening to is greater compassion for people different than ourselves, a greater sense of justice and of love and oneness for people different than ourselves. So this is an amazing time in history. I mean, I grew up during the 1960s, and I haven't seen anything like this since then. And I'm very excited by it. I'm very excited by all the positive change that I am affirming is going to come out of this time that is painful in many ways. So when I came out as a lesbian, it was about 1980. And coming out is in itself an act of mindfulness, right? A choice to make myself visible. I could remain closeted. At the time, I took to the streets, went on pride marches, I showed up at various protests. That was the time of Larry Kramer in the 80s started ACT UP. So there were a lot of mindful protests and active protests about the AIDS crisis. And there were protests around the murders of George Moscone and Harvey Milk. And I was at UC Berkeley when I came out, so we did lots of creative kind of protests. Like one example is we went to the Chancellor's Ball, which was this very traditional thing to welcome in freshmen, where they would assign you to a opposite gender faculty member to invite you to dance. So we decided to rebel and say we wanted to dance with the same-sex faculty member. And so we did a lot of things like that that were just sort of challenging the norms of the times. And so I participated in a lot of movements from the anti-war protests to the People's Park demonstrations in Berkeley to women's marches, LGBTQ stuff. And when this Black Lives Movement protests started happening during this COVID shutdown, I had to consider what's mine to do here. I'm 60, I just turned 60 as a matter of fact, and I am what's considered a vulnerable population. So do I want to go out into the streets and march? My daughter was, but I had to really think about that. So I mindfully considered that, and I decided to go to a small local protest in Albany where I live, and it felt really good because it was something about putting my feet on the ground and taking action that felt right. I've done a lot of other things as well, but speaking, chanting, marching, there was something very that action felt mindful, and I did it safely. I thought about how did I want to do it that I would feel safe. So the other mindful action that I've decided that I need to take is educating myself more about racism, more about Black issues in this country and in the world. And I'm going to be participating in the CSL class that studies the book that just came out this year called Me and White Supremacy. And I'm really looking forward to that. I'm really ready to look at myself, to look at my own privilege. So, hopefully this will get you to think about what is yours to do. Maybe what more is yours to do? What have you been holding yourself back from doing about this or about anything in your life? So just to wrap up my piece anyway, in Science of Mind, we're very aware that we need to change our beliefs in order to change the world. And we know that we cannot change that which we cannot see, name, or feel. So I think the reason that so many issues are coming to the surface right now, it's actually it's sparking this change, which is needed. Then we can become mindful of the actions we want to take. And just a last quote here by Victor Hugo: "Nothing is stronger than an idea whose time has come." So let's just let ourselves be moved into what it is we're here to do, what it is we're here to change, because we don't want to sleep through this great revolution. So I'm going to pass it along to Doug, and he's going to expand on some of what I've said, and then at the end, we'll open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Chantal. That was wonderful. Okay, so I don't have a pride flag with me, but I do have my RuPaul doll. I just thought I'd share that with you. I spent way too much money for it, but RuPaul's Drag Race is my guilty pleasure. I love RuPaul, and the only quote I'm going to use tonight is one of RuPaul's, which is, if you can't love yourself, how in the hell are you going to love somebody else? Can I get an amen up in here? So amen, everybody. All right. So after Chantal and I were invited to present tonight, I was trying to think about what I wanted to do around gay pride. And what I decided to do was to try to weave together for you some actions that some Bay Area faith centers have taken as mindful action amid the demands for equality in the LGBTQ plus community. So I'm going, if you're from the Bay Area, you probably know of Glide Memorial United Methodist Church, which is in San Francisco in the Tenderloin. Back in 1963 was when Reverend Cecil Williams became the pastor there. And in 64, Glide Church actually helped form the Council on Religion and the Homosexual in the effort to try to help close the gap between people of faith and the homosexual community. So keep in mind, this is the early 60s. Homosexuality was still considered a disease, and people lost their jobs if people discovered that they were gay or lesbian or trans. And at the same point in time, so back in the early 60s, under the formation of Glide Memorial Church, there was a queer youth group that was created called Vanguard, and they had a lot of like young transgender members of this group, and unfortunately, still today, a lot of especially trans women, have to survive doing sex work because they're not able to find jobs. And so the issues facing the gay and transgender youth in the 1960s really kind of produced these like radical insights into the connection between economic class and police violence and incarceration and trans and homophobia. So keep in mind, this is like almost 60 years ago, right? At the same time, also under Glide, there was a lesbian group of street people that was formed called the Street Orphans. Chantal, when she talked, mentioned the uprising at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village. And a lot of people don't know that actually 3 years earlier than that, so that was back in 1969, there was a riot in San Francisco in 1966. Also in the Tenderloin, which is where Glide Church is, there was an all-night joint called Compton's Cafeteria. It was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it was a chain of restaurants in San Francisco. And the Tenderloin location of Compton's was at Taylor and Turk, so kind of right in the heart of the Tenderloin. And it was one of the few places where transgender people, and especially the trans women, could congregate publicly in the city. Because keep in mind, they were working as sex workers primarily. And they were unwelcome in the gay bars due to transphobia. And so Compton's management and staff really tried to deter the trans women and also the drag queens from frequenting it, and they would often call the police. The police would come in, they'd harass these people, and often arrest them because back then there was a crime in San Francisco for female impersonation. So as these crackdowns kind of continued, the management tried to levy like a service fee to keep people out, and they were afraid that they were losing customers because of these undesirables that were coming to the restaurant. And so on an evening in August of 1966, the management of Compton's called the police department, and they said there were some transgender people, I'm sure that's not what they called them, being raucous. And so the police showed up, and they were known to really mistreat these women. And one of the officers in particular went up to one of the women that was sitting there having coffee, and he was getting ready to arrest her, and she said to him, "No more," and she threw her cup of coffee in his face, and then the whole cafeteria just erupted. Dishes were flying, the furniture was thrown, the plate glass windows were smashed, the police were called for reinforcements, the fighting spilled out onto the street, a police car had all of its windows broken out, the sidewalk newsstand that was out front was burnt to the ground, and they came back a second night with more transgender people, more hustlers, more Tenderloin Street people, and other members of the LGBTQ community joined in the picket of the cafeteria, which at that point said, "You're not welcome to come back in." They put in new plate glass windows, and they were broken again. So in the wake of the Stonewall riots of '69, groups in New York and in San Francisco and elsewhere became very, very active in promoting gay rights. And the first Pride parades commemorated a year later to commemorate what had happened at Stonewall. So that's when you really started to see newspapers, and there were disparate efforts. And back then it was kind of called the Gay Liberation Movement in the United States. And it was really primarily gay men and lesbians. So at that point in San Francisco in 1970, Metropolitan was established, and it was a spiritual home for many who felt really alienated from their religious heritage due to sexual orientation. And so it was considered back then a gay church. It was located in the Mission District, and it was a victim of arson. So luckily, no congregants or anyone was injured in the fire. But it was an anchor, a spiritual anchor for a lot of gay people in San Francisco, as the gay rights movement was kind of establishing its legs in the 70s. And keep in mind, in the 70s, the very first bar to have windows, clear windows, was the Twin Peaks Tavern. And if you've been to the Castro, it's right at the corner of 17th and Castro Street, right just a few doors above the Castro Theater. And because people were afraid. And this was the first time that people were sort of willing to be seen, if you will, from the sidewalk. There were also a lot of proliferation of lesbian bars, and women's organizations began to emerge. There were bars like Maud's and Peg's Place and Amelia's on Valencia Street. And in the late 70s, Peg's Place actually was also the assault by off-duty members of the San Francisco Vice Squad. And that event actually drew a lot of national attention to the other incidences of anti-gay violence and police harassment within the LGBT community. It was also a time where there were a lot of gay murders. Chantal mentioned the trans women that were killed this month, the 4 of them. There have been already 16 other murders this year, 14 of which were trans women of color, and 2 were trans men. But back in 76, the amount of homicides in San Francisco was 10% of the murders that were happening. At that point, also, gay bars were actually frequent targets of bombing. They were targets of arson. And by the end of the 70s, the Metropolitan Community Church congregation was able to find a permanent home in the Castro on Eureka Street. So moving into the 80s, the San Francisco gay community was devastated by the AIDS epidemic following the discovery of the HIV virus in 1989. And in the early 80s, AIDS began affecting the male population, gay male population of San Francisco, with the disease continuing to have fatal effects, certainly through the 90s. In San Francisco alone, prior to the introduction of drugs that treated AIDS, close to 16,000 men died due to the virus. And so there was a lot of fear and not knowing about how it was spread. Does this sound familiar and what we're going through right now? And most painfully, many religious people pronounced that AIDS was a divine punishment for homosexuality, and that the people deserved to die, and that they had brought it upon themselves. And so it was during this peak of the HIV/AIDS crisis that MCC was a massive support center for the population. And unfortunately, it was not uncommon for them to have 3 to 5 funerals each day on the weekends when they did funerals. The growth of the church membership could barely keep up with the rate of the deaths, and yet it persevered. And during the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s, MCC really stepped up to the plate, and they ministered to the ill, they ministered to the dying and to the mourning with support groups and services, and they continue to be a de facto community center for a lot of support groups in the community. In I think it was about 2016. The building that MCC was located at in the Castro was deemed unsafe, and so they lost that space, and it was closed for good in the Castro. They've since moved to a space on Polk Street, and which is where they still are. Also in that same time frame, in the Castro, what is a Catholic church. It's still there. It's called the Most Holy Redeemer Church. It's been in the Castro since 1900. And in the 80s, seeing the change in the neighborhood, Father Tony McGuire, who was the pastor at the time, brought together his congregation largely who were older women, older white women, and a few gay men who decided to join the parish. And together they began an outreach to the gay population of the neighborhood. And as the AIDS epidemic hit the gay community, the Most Holy Redeemer Church parish began providing services to those men. And the parish paired parishioners with people who were suffering from AIDS in the neighborhood. They would give them rides to doctors. They would help them around the house, or help them with any other needs that they might have. And it was the older women in the parish who were really instrumental in the ministry, and their support of people living with HIV continues to this day. And the last Faith Center I just want to touch base on is the Hartford Street Zen Center. The name of the temple is Isanji, which means One Mountain Temple. It's a Soto Zen practice center. It was founded by Isan Dorsey. He was a former prostitute. He was a drug addict. He was a drag queen. He was in the Navy. He's a fascinating character, and he brought the center from its early beginnings as the Gay Buddhist Club in 1980 to the Zen Center, and he actually ended up becoming abbot there in 1989. What they ended up doing was opening up the Maitri Hospice for men who were dying of AIDS, and unfortunately, Isan himself succumbed to the disease in 1990, but it was the very first Buddhist hospice of its kind in the United States. So that just gives you sort of a framework of some kind of highlights of events that happened in San Francisco and the participation of faith communities. And I think where we are right now, because of the prejudice and the scapegoating that we see, we're particularly alert to the ways that, like, COVID-19 is affecting the Black and Latinx communities, even here in the Bay Area. There's an increase of anti-Asian rhetoric and violence incited by 45, who calls this a Chinese virus. And so I think for all of us to kind of keep in mind to stay strong, and to kind of paraphrase Dr. King, if this disease affects any of us, it affects all of us. And indeed, the pandemic does affect all of us. And COVID-19 brings into sharp relief society's bias and inequities, and this is especially true for people in the LGBTQ plus community in the Bay Area. I wanted to share with you 4 values of the MCC Church because I think they'll resonate. And keep in mind, they're a Christian denomination, although they're very gay positive. So one of their values is equality. We believe that all people are equally deserving of God's love. Radical inclusion. We believe our understanding of the divine deepens by demonstrating radical inclusion and compassion, embracing the diversity of all people and all beings. Spiritual transformation. We believe in being the change we seek through the transformation of self and by the respect, love, and honor we give one another. And social action. We believe that God has no hands but ours, no feet but ours, no face but ours. Therefore, we believe it is our spiritual responsibility to promote social action. And so I'm going to close with a post I saw from one of my absolute favorite actresses, Viola Davis. She wrote, "Radical change can take place in homes, in schools, in bedrooms, voting booths, etc. 400 years of systematic racism needs a comprehensive array of radical revolutionary intervention. Some are posting on social media. Some are protesting in the streets. Some are donating silently. Some are educating themselves. Some are having tough conversations with family and friends. revolution has many lanes. Be kind to yourself and to others who are traveling in the same direction. Just keep your foot on the gas. Thanks so much.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
And I think now we're going to open up for any questions. And we have a request, so if there's anyone actually who is part of the LGBTQ plus community that would like to start, please let us know or let the hosts know.
Thank you, Doug, for everything. This is Dorothy Mendez. I just have a question. I heard Chantal refer to African-American LGBT women were murdered. Is that what I heard?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think because of their color is why they were murdered, or was there other circumstances behind that?
Well, I think it's a combination, Dorothy. I mean, trans women tend to stand out and they receive a lot of harassment, and a lot of hate crimes are directed at them. And then the fact that they're also people of color, the majority of trans people murdered in this country in hate crimes are people of color. So
Okay.
you have the two types of hatred working together.
So my other question is, so what are we doing to bring that forward? We know what's happening to the African American male. Okay, that's been happening for over hundreds of years. But what is the community doing to bring forth those women of color who are LGBT? What are we doing to
Well, in LA, there was a march, a Black trans march with 50,000 people in the past few weeks. There's been several marches that are specifically for Black trans lives.
Okay.
So there is some attention being paid to the issue. Probably not enough, because obviously not everybody even knows that it's happening.
No.
You barely.
Yeah, and there was a march last Friday in San Francisco for Black trans people, that ended up at where the former Compton cafeteria. There's actually a plaque there, and they don't actually. And so part of the problem too is that it goes unreported that the Human Rights Committee, HRC, is documenting all of the murders that they know are specific hate crimes. Unfortunately, a lot of they don't get reported.
Okay.
And also, there's a lot of, unfortunately, still there's a lot of trans women who are forced to be sex workers, and so if they're working the street as a prostitute, they're in a situation that's very dangerous. And you have then a lot of men who are struggling with their own sexuality and may become then violent, and that violence escalates to murder against the women.
Yeah.
It's a horrible thing, and there's not enough light on our media that's being shown on this. It's a horrible, horrible thing.
And I should say that the group of transgender people has one of the highest rates of unemployment and homelessness because of just tremendous discrimination. And so this civil rights that passed in the Supreme Court is significant. It doesn't mean there's not going to be discrimination, but it's at least going to mean that it's not legal.
Thank you, Chantal. Thank you.
Who else has a comment?
Hi, my name is Sam.
Hi, Sam.
Hi, Chantal. Thank you, Chantal and Doug, for an excellent presentation. I know we don't have enough time, but I really appreciate your share, both of you shares tonight. Also to shine light, like what you said, that the LGBTQ youth is probably one of the highest suicide rates, if not the highest in the nation.
Yes.
And I know there are a lot of groups who are trying to address psychosocial and spiritual issues among the LGBTQ youth. But I thought it would be important to mention that in this discussion tonight. And I also came from MCC, by the way,
No, did you?
before going to OCSL. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important issue. It's among youth, I think LGBTQ youth are the highest rate of suicide. Yeah. Quite a high amount of suicide attempts and completed suicides. So there's a lot more work to do, towards acceptance.
Oh, hi, it's Constance.
Constance.
I just want to say a couple things. One is that a fact that not many people at Oakland Center know is that I lived as a lesbian for 30 years in Canada, and my coming out was not particularly mindful. It was fearful, and that's another story I won't go into. But I was involved in the 70s, in the mid 70s, all the way on in the a lot of the changes that were going on in Canada. And one of the things, because I got to know quite a few trans people, and one of the things that I found that is true in Canada is that there are a lot more First Nation people who are trans than there are in other populations. I was actually meant to go on Google last night to see if that's true in the African American community here. I don't know whether it's true or not. But the other thing is that you get just like you were talking about with the trans women who are being killed, that they're women of color, so they've got at least two things that they're dealing with in terms of that. The same thing is true with suicide of the youth. Like in Canada, the Aboriginal youth have one of the highest suicide rates. And then if you put them being gay or trans or anything else on top of that, it just really is amazing that anyone lives, to be perfectly honest. Mm-hmm. So, and the other thing I wanted to bring up is all my life I've had this thing, particularly after I came out, about why it was so hard for one group to understand that the discrimination and the hatred that they were experiencing wasn't just theirs alone, because there was often it didn't, like we say, that what happens to one happens to all of us, and yet in the various movements that doesn't happen. So that in the African American community there may be discrimination against trans people. In the gay community, there's certainly in the early and on up, the LGBTQ, it was very white, and we didn't understand at all anything about our white privilege and how we were excluding people of color from that movement. And so it's I think it has to start with the understanding that one oppression is not separate from all oppressions. Mm-hmm. And then, like you say, then we've got to each do our own work, like, because I was part of that community and because I was a feminist and I worked with battered women and all this other stuff, I somehow thought I'd gotten it. And now I'm really having to come to grips with the fact that first of all, part of the reason I stayed in Canada was because I didn't know how to deal with the racism here. And it was easier to be there and pretend like I didn't have to deal with it. But so coming back here, I have to really deal with my own white supremacy, and I'm glad to be doing it. It's not easy, but so that's one of the issues that for me is that we just really have to recognize that one oppression is not separate from another one. They're all part and parcel of the same. So, thank you.
That's right. Thank you. Who else wants to speak? Probably
I have
just have. Mhm.
one footnote, if I may, to the talk tonight. I just wanted to highlight a couple of films and one book that relate to what I spoke to. So there was a documentary. It's about an hour long. It's quite short. It's called Screaming Queens: The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria. My ex-partner Jim, he co-wrote a book called Gay by the Bay with Susan Stryker, who is a trans historian, and she was, after she had her PhD, she was working for the Gay History Project in San Francisco, and had heard sort of these very coded things about some riot that had taken place in San Francisco in the 60s. They don't even know the exact date in August that happened. There's only a few people still around that remember it, but they don't even have any police records. That's how just brushed under everything that event was. So all we know, it was in August of '66. So again, that one's called Screaming Queens: The Riot at Compton's Cafe. Laverne Cox, the actress who you may know from Orange is the New Black, she is the executive producer of a brand new film that just launched on Netflix this week. It's called Disclosure, and it's a look at Hollywood's depiction of transgender people and the impact of this on American culture. It was first screened at the Sundance Film Festival, so that's also available on Netflix. Another film that's fascinating around especially trans people of color is from the 90s, but it's called Paris is Burning, and it's a film on the New York ball culture in the 1980s. If you've seen the television series Pose, it's set in that same that realm, so it's really fascinating. Chantal had mentioned The Normal Heart, which was written by Larry Kramer, who founded the Gay Men's Health Crisis and then went on to found ACT UP. It's an HBO film that was written by Larry Kramer. He did the screenplay based on his play from 1985, and it's basically a story about him. It's about a gay activist who attempts to raise HIV and AIDS awareness during the 1980s, when gay men did not want to hear about having to have safe sex. So it was a very hard-fought battle. And then lastly, there's a book that I recommend. It's called Street Zen. It's the life and work of Isan Dorsey. And so Isan Dorsey was the man who was at the Zen Center in San Francisco in the Castro. And it's a fascinating account. He was born in Santa Barbara, and it talks about his life in the military and being a gay guy and being a drug addict and being a drag queen, and then ultimately finding Buddhism and starting this space in San Francisco.
What was the name of that one again, Doug?
Street Zen.
Street Zen. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and I would recommend people watch Pose if you haven't seen it. It's a really good show that talks about primarily people of color who are transgender at a time where it really wasn't safe. And Tales of the City also has the Compton Cafe riots in that one. So just as we're all trying to educate ourselves about Black lives right now and watching movies and things, this is Pride Month. There's a ton of stuff out there, a lot of films, a lot of documentaries, So check it out, because we all need to know each other's histories, right? So thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you to Doug, and thank you to everyone here tonight. I'm so grateful to have had this discussion with you all. So let's just take a breath and just bringing ourselves into this present moment, to that heart of God that is beating in each one of us. That precious, tender, beautiful heart that beats through each one, that beats through in the entire universe, that connects us all in this field of oneness. This oneness, this peace, this love that is God. And I know we are each from that. We are each sourced by that. And I just give thanks for this coming together in oneness, for growth, for expansion, for awakening at such a time as this. So grateful for each person present tonight, for each heart, for each breath, for the breath of life. And so just sending us each on our way to that next thing. We're probably already in the safety of our homes, and just letting my word go. I let it be, and so it is.